Gary Argabright. I live in Chillicothe in Ross County, but I was born in Jackson County. And I was a Latin school teacher for 31 years. I have a lot of degree work in ancient Greeks and Romans and Egypt and Mesopotamia. It's all of interest to me. And I moved to Chillicothe soon after I married my wife. And when we settled there, I couldn't get my archaeology fix. And so I started following up on something that had happened many years before that. When I was 10 years old, I was riding around the Jackson County Fairgrounds on my bicycle with one of my friends, and lo and behold, I looked down and there was a, quote, arrowhead lying there in the dirt. I picked it up and I saved it for, let's see, that would have been in 59, and I really got started doing this in 79, so 20 years later. And since then, I have contacted countless farmers. I have 69 different collections from farms in Ross County and a couple overlapping counties around it, and probably have found something like, easily in excess of 10,000 artifacts, and maybe closer to 20 if you count things that are broken but still identifiable. And my interest in this just continues to grow, and the one thing I've learned is the more that I know, the more I know there is to know that I need to know to really understand better the things that I think I know. Yeah, I mean, it's that kind of a deal. So anyways, a couple of things to say though. We're going to be talking about, I can actually go to this, I guess, the Harness Artifact Collection. And this is a collection that was put together by a friend of mine named Bob Harness, and he's now passed away. But the people who own the farm now want to make sure that I'm not, through this presentation, encouraging all of you to knock on their door or sneak in their fields and collect artifacts, because it's private property, it's off limits to visitors, and nobody is hunting artifacts there, not even the current owners of the farm. And really there is nothing to be found on the surface anymore because it's all no-till. And I've tried. So that's not going to work. And then let's see. Why am I talking about the Harness Artifact Collection? You'll find out some things about Mr. Harness in a minute, but I am the current caretaker of that collection. So not only have I got several thousand artifacts for study, it's all things that I feel I'm a caretaker of. I don't feel like I own anything. But I hunted for 20 years with Mr. Harness, and we talked about what should he do with his collection when he has passed away, and he thought about giving it to the Ohio History Connection. He thought about giving it to a local museum, thought about building his own museum, whatever. And he ended up entrusting it with me. And this is a man who had this spirit of share everything that I have found, meaning Bob, so that people can learn about the past. And he had this basement museum that he probably in the years he lived there had something like 2,000 visitors, and he would take the time and spend 3 hours with you going through that collection if you were interested. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about this collection, and the subtitle there, Some Perspectives on an Ancient Ross County Landscape and Its Use by People. This collection is so special that you can actually look at the artifacts and look at the fields that he identified, and you will be able to get a perspective on how land was used in ancient times and when it was being used and what kind of groups of people were using it. So with that said, I've got 95 slides. Whew. It's going to include maps, and we'll be talking about the landscape of the Harness Farm. We're going to actually talk only about the flint artifacts, even though all kinds of hard stone artifacts and bone artifacts have been found there as well. We're going to talk about the sites and how Bob identified those. We're going to talk about this farm is famous because it is has one of the major earthworks in Ross County on it, called the Liberty Earthworks, and I'll be showing you something about that. And everybody knows about that, but what I really want to focus on, I guess that's better, is the non-Hopewellian sites. Because people really do not know much about that, and Ross County's up for this World Heritage nomination because of our Hopewellian sites, and you can't understand these people unless you understand the people that came before. So with that said, let's get to it, Gary. So where is the Harness Farm? It's located in the southeast corner of Ross County, and outlined in red there, the red dots or dashes, is a 1,500 acre farm that has been in the Harness family since the late 1700s. And that gives this collection some advantage over many other collections for study purposes. It's part of a 5.5 mile long glacial terrace between the Scioto River and Walnut Creek. So if you see the green ... that's this upland terrace that overlooks the Scioto River Valley. And that is so special, as you're going to find out. And if you look at a map of the glaciation of Ohio, it's just south of what is known as the Wisconsin maximum. And you see the red square? I'm going to walk over just to make sure. That's where the farm's located. It's right on the tip of where the Wisconsin Glacier stopped. So let's go back to when the first glaciers came across what we call Ohio. And you've got to excuse my maps here. I did the best I could with the drawing apps that I had, but everything that I add to this blank map here is my responsibility. It's simplified, but it gets the job done, I think. So here's hoping. So the landscape of the Harness Farm in all of Ohio was impacted by geological events which began some 2.6 million years ago. And you'll see what I mean. There was no Lake Erie, believe it or not. There's no Ohio River, no Scioto River, no Miami, no Hocking, no Muskingum. Those are all post-glacial. There were two rivers that geologists have identified. Who knows, there may be something else, but how do you go back 2.6 million years ago and figure what was there when the glaciers come through and changed everything? I mean, it's like having a bulldozer the size of half of the state of Ohio bulldozing over the surface there. But there were two rivers. The first of those is lesser known. It's called the Aragon. And if you look at the arrows on the blue lines there, it flows kind of northerly and then goes eastward. And that's why I've got the north and the east on the little compass there. The other river is much more famous. It's called the Taze. And anybody that lives in south central Ohio knows about the Taze River. There's even a Taze Valley school system. The Mead complex in Chillicothe, Ohio actually gets its water from the remnant of that Taze River. It's like several hundred feet down. It's an underground river these days. And it flows to the west, northwest, and actually emptied into what today we think of as the Wabash River system in Indiana. But 2.6 million years ago, we have something known as the Pleistocene age. That's an age of glaciers, and there are at least 4 glaciers known. Most people only talk about the Illinoisan and the Wisconsin. Those are the latest, and then they say the pre-Illinoisan, but other geologists have identified a Kansan glacier and a Nebraskan glacier. There is no test, but I do want to emphasize there's more to this. And you can see how once those glaciers formed in that period over 2.6 million years ago, those two river systems were frozen solid, on and off, again and again and again. That's going to be important. The Taze River, starting in here, actually gets its origins all the way down in North Carolina, northwestern North Carolina, where the New River is. And if you know anything about weird names, it's odd that the oldest river possibly in the world is known as the New River, but it's a famous river. But because of those ice jams, about 787,000 years ago, calculated, the water started spilling out under the ice and filling in all of the valleys between the various ridges and hilltops in southern Ohio, northeastern Kentucky, and northwestern West Virginia. And then what happens? So you got to imagine the Taze is underwater and it's frozen, and the water that was supposed to go to it is trapped there and creates a lake known as Lake Tite. It was named for the man who discovered it. It was unknown until just within the last 60 or 70 years. But there are all kinds of signs that it was there. There was so much water dammed up there that it caused a 7.0 magnitude seismic event just from the weight of that water. And I got that from Kurt Shoemaker, the geology professor at Shawnee State. He gave an excellent talk several weeks ago, and he mentioned that. I hadn't heard about that. It also created this Lake Tite, and Kurt and his students, doing some exploration in the Portsmouth area, actually found some places where the water surface was lapping up against some ridges and actually eroded these notches into them. And they found two notches, one at 825 feet and one at 900 feet, telling us that at some points this river was 900 feet deep. Anybody know anything about Lake Erie? Who fishes there?
I live on here.
How deep is it?
Pretty shallow.
200 feet. This thing is more than 4 times deeper than Lake Erie. It's incredible. But notice Ripley. We've all heard of Ripley if you live in southern Ohio. This water's collecting there. You've got this gigantic Wisconsin glacier, the last one, pushing up against it. And you got to remember, glaciers, they flow, and they kind of ebb and flow. They'll come down, and then they'll back up, and then they'll regrind that soil again, and then they'll back up. They may go a few miles further or a few miles less, but whatever. They're moving that dirt, and they're crunching it up. And as a result, these icebergs form as the water, or as the ice calves off of the glacier, falls in Lake Tite, hauls all kinds of debris, and eventually it disrupts the boundaries of Lake Tite, and part of the Ohio River was formed between Ripley and Cincinnati. And that's the first leg in the formation of the Ohio River, and that's about 750,000 years ago. Lake Tite itself only, as far as they can tell, it only existed for less than 12,000 years. But the things that it caused is what gave us the landscape that we see today. I'm making up the rest of this because nobody knows the order. It's too far back. But over time, Ohio's modern river systems developed something like this. So you got the Ripley leg, then you got a Portsmouth leg, then you got a Marietta leg, a Wheeling leg, and an East Liverpool leg. And as that's all forming, we get the Scioto River, not in any particular order, but this is all happening, overlapping through time, the Miami River system, the Muskingum River system, and the Hocking River system. And at this point, we're down to about 13,000 years ago. So the first people to come into Ohio actually found a fully developed water system, and water is crucial for everything in anybody's existence, and it made Ohio very attractive. On top of that, Ohio had great flint deposits, and some of the best flints in the United States, at least. So as that's all happening, guess what's happening up there where the Aragon was? Lake Erie is collecting water, and it's scooped out a little more by the retreating Wisconsin glacier. And at first, Lake Erie was kind of lopsided and more to the west than to the northeast, and it actually drained into Indiana. But there's something called isostatic pressure from this glacier, and Ohio was like a sponge, and it was pressed down by a glacier that was between 1 and 2 to possibly even 3 miles in places. So imagine that Ohio springing back as that glacier is retreating north, and by the time it's on the other side of Lake Erie, that part has sprung up enough to where the waters from Lake Erie no longer drain west. They drain to the east to the Niagara Escarpment. And I use my imagination, and I may be fudging a little here, but I think this is highly possible. There were some Native Americans sitting up on that escarpment, checking for mammoth or caribou or whatever, strangers walking through their land. And somebody says, "My leg's getting wet." And they would have been there, quite possibly, for the first water to go over that escarpment and form Niagara Falls. Isn't that incredible? Humans were there. There's no doubt they were there because they were exploring every nook and cranny in North America.
So the water that went into Indiana, that formed the Kankakee Basin.
I'm sure that it would have impacted that and what the Black Swamp area and all that was,
There's a lot of people don't know about.
Exactly.
The biggest swamps were not in Florida, they were in Indiana.
Exactly. And this isn't taught in schools. You have to be a geologist to actually get exposed to this, or go to neat meetings like Jeb and Pam and I do. So we get to see this stuff. All right, so how does this impact that little square of 1,500 acres? And this is bleaching out. We'll make some sense of it. But one thing I want to point out to you. Basically, we're going to be really talking about this line here because that's an edge of a terrace. And that edge of that terrace contains 400 feet of sand and gravel that were left behind by that bulldozing glacier. And I think I can show you this with some color. So kind of orient yourself, keeping in mind there's a glacier, or there's a terrace up there. There is a major river system that runs on the western edge of this farm, and that's the Scioto. And it actually has another almost river, which is very popular with people in Ross County, called Paint Creek. And this is the confluence of the creek and the river there. And that confluence basically matches up with the end of that terrace. So that would have been a real hot spot. Yes. So there's the upper terrace outlined in green. Look at the elevation. Between 620 or 600 and 620 feet. The bottoms, as we're working our way down, there's a lower terrace right here and another edge of it, or a peninsula basically, jutting out right there, and that's at about 30 feet lower at 590 feet. Boy, if I'm a primitive culture of people, and I use the word primitive as in the sense of old, not in the sense of unrefined, perfect place like the Niagara Escarpment to check out anything going down in the bottoms or other places I'll be talking about here. So if you look at the bottoms, 565-foot elevation. So basically it's almost 60 feet difference between being in the bottoms and being up on the terrace. And at the top of that terrace, guess what there would have been running north? Huge prairies, flat land, ideal for things like mammoth, which are grazing animals, and later on caribou.
And that was created by the glacier.
Yes, that's 400 feet of gravel flattened out, and as you go further north and west, you get these big moraines.
Then it just left.
Yeah, it's spitting out all this stuff that it has carried along and chewed up. And across the Scioto, there's a forested sandstone ridge today, and I'm sure it would have been forested as well soon after or right before the first explorers from ancient times came into this area. And that's at a 980-foot elevation. So what kind of animals in the at the end of the Pleistocene hung out in forests? Mastodons. So you got the mastodons eating trees and brush, and you got the mammoths grazing. So they got the best of food sources right there, plus they're, in my mind, they're going way beyond mammoths and mastodons. And then along the river, there are going to be all of these little channel edge niches of special critters and plants that they could have accessed, and along with a lot of cottonwood and willow trees there as well. And let's see what else I'm adding to this. I don't see what I brought. Oh, yeah, to kind of orient you. So I'm going to match this aerial view, which was taken in the 1950s, with a map that's coming up, a topo map. And there's a Musgrove Road running off of it. And then back to the bottoms. And even to this day, when I used to hunt with Bob, after the spring rains, there would be water 4-6 feet deep in these sloughs. And ideal places that would have ponded up, and beaver and other animals could have lived in those environments. Again, this would have been a haven of wildlife for anybody who stumbled upon it and decided, I'm going to stay here a while. All right, now changing gears. That is Mr. Harness. He died in 2008. That is Mr. Harness and Gary Argabright doing a hunt for a reporter at the local newspaper. Oh, a little less hair yet, but anyway, he was a great man. He loved his farm. His farm was a showcase. I mean, it was like a country club. When you drove down the lanes, everything was mowed. It was a beautiful place. And to manage 1,500 acres of farming, and every spare chance he got, he would be out in the fields looking for his artifacts.
So did he inherit this land?
Yes, he would be like the fourth generation of the people that.
He was the caretaker.
Yes, he became the caretaker out of all his brothers and sisters. And he actually went to the Ohio State in agriculture in the 1930s, and they taught him all this stuff about modern farming technology, and he brought it back. He joined all the farm that had been separated off, because in those days, if you have a daughter, you got to get rid of her some way, so you've got to give some land to get somebody to marry her, to get the best deal anyway. And so a lot of the farm got divided up, but he was able to join it all back together, and so he had a middle farm, an upper farm, and then the old home place, which still exists. Now, his collection is so special. It's a surface collection. It's not made up of digging all over the farm. There were some things, some mounds that were bulldozed over early on, and who knew if there was going to be anything in them or not. And there may be 2 artifacts out of that entire collection that possibly came from a mound. So it's not like grave robbing or anything like that. It is walking corn rows and picking up things that have been washed off by the rain. In the early days, it was exposed by moldboard and chisel plowing, and Bob spent 40 years of his life collecting. And every single thing he found, he washed up with a toothbrush, and he wrote a number on it based on the fields that he identified as artifact-bearing fields. And so everything is cataloged. And that is unlike most farm collections you'll ever come across. But more than that, he controlled who came into the farm. And he didn't just let anybody come in. He let myself and my friend Joe Bennett, and I knew of maybe 4 other people over the years that hunted with him. And everything that Joe and I found, we showed it to him. And if he thought it was something different than what he had in the collection, he says, I think we need to keep this with the collection. And we were more than happy to follow his advice on that, because we knew this collection was going to be something special. And it actually is a total record of the stone tool development and technology of that area of southern Ohio. And it's also a record of the peoples who visited there over a 14,000 year time span. It's incredible. And I just feel privileged to be in charge of it. Well, in the 1990s, an archaeologist named Sean Coughlin, who was associated with Kent State at that time, needed to do a master's thesis. And he decided he would ask Mr. Harness if he could study the flint artifacts in the collection. And in the process, he analyzed 2,993, I call them PPKs instead of projectile points, because they're not all projectile points. A lot of them are knives and saws and other tools like that. And out of those, he was not able to classify 494. So roughly 2,500 of those, he was able to say, this is a St. Charles PPK, this is a or some people call those dovetails, this is a Thebes, blah, 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 and whatever. And in the process, Sean believed that there were 76 different types of PPKs in this collection, flint tools. That's a crazy amount, because most people don't realize this. Excuse me for digressing. It's not like if you had lived back then, any of you, and you were able to nap out a flint tool, take this block of stone that you found and you start chipping away at it, and you want to make a Clovis point, and I'll show you what a Clovis point is in a minute, and you make a mistake and go, oh, I've lost half of that because I knocked a big flake off that I can't do anything with this now, so I'm going to shorten it, I'm going to make a Thebes out of it, or I'm going to make a dovetail out of it, or I'm going to make a little triangle out of it. They didn't do that. Every one of these prehistoric groups of people had their own tool technology, and they consistently made the same types of tools for many times between 500 and 1,000 years. That's an incredible span of time. The United States hasn't been in existence that long. So use your imagination. Yeah, this is incredible, and most people don't realize that. So anyhow, many of these PPK types have been placed into clusters. So there's something called a Thebes cluster. There's something called a Clovis cluster and whatever. And those have a bunch of other contemporary points with little variations. But then those clusters are in existence for year after year after year. And please ask a question if I've confused you on that. This is just a quick listing of the ones that Sean identified. That's one page. And then in the blue down at the bottom, I thought, well, even though these are not projectile points or knives, there are very significant Hopewell points that are recognizable to any archaeologist, and they're called the Hopewell Coors and the Hopewell Bladeless, and I'll show you some of those too. And in the process of doing his thesis, Sean compared and recorded the time periods associated with each of those groupings of point types, and he related them to the field sites that Bob had discovered on his farm. And what happened is 1,500 acres, Bob basically had 45 different fields that he was plowing. And one year this field would be in corn, and this one would be in wheat, and this one would be in soybean and whatever, and then he would rotate those. But he designated those farms with fields with numbers. And so if he's hunting in what he designated as field number 1 and he finds a PPK there, picks it up, brings it back, washes it up, puts a 1 on it, and then he puts on his map, I've got points I'm finding in site 1. And every single point he found in that field was given a 1. And he did that for 45 different sites. So and in many cases, he could walk you to within 15 feet of where he found that point. That's how precise he was. He even had a map. I didn't put this in here. It was an aerial view of the farm and showed his 15 favorite points and exactly where they were located. So here are the 45 sites. I've taken one of the aerial photographs of the farm, and I've superimposed all of the different fields and where the artifacts came from. And 2 of those property or fields were actually associated with a man named Russell Brown, but again, that's because of marriages, and it eventually comes back to the actual harness farm. Sean determined that out of those some 2,500 points that he was able to identify, 80% of those had to have been made during the Hopewell period. That's why Ross County is a World Heritage Site, because the Hopewell people were there, and it may have been the center of all Hopewellian activity in prehistoric time. It's that big of a deal. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at some things about the Hopewell. Like I said, the farm is famous for the Liberty Earthworks, and especially within that earthworks, there's a mound known as the Edwin Harness Mound, and the fact of the scope of this thing and the number of artifacts that were found there, this piece of land was very, very important to Hopewell groups locally and all the way into Illinois, all the way down into North Carolina. It drew them all. And of course, this was some 2,000 years ago, and the importance of that land is still attracting people to this day, especially the archaeologists. So here is the Liberty Earthworks, as drawn by Squire and Davis, as Jeffrey talked about their work earlier. It's from plate 20, and it's composed of 3 major features, and so it's called a tripartite earthwork. And it's got a small little circle that's only 800 feet in diameter. It's got a large circle that's almost 1,800 feet in diameter. square with almost 1,100-foot sides to it. And then I don't know, this isn't counted in it because 1, 2, 3, tripartite, but I call this thing the question mark. When I was a Latin teacher, I had this student named Fred Bearkirker, and he would turn his tests in, and he always drew this circle with a smiley face and a dot here. Instead of 2 eyes, he gave it 1, and it was his smiley cyclops. And it kind of reminds me of that upside down. So I'm never forgetting that kid. The largest of 14 mounds associated with this is the Edwin Harness Mound, in green right there. Scale of it, 160 feet long, 90 feet wide, 20 feet high. Been dated by charcoal that was found associated with burials in the mound, somewhere between 265 and 395 years Christian era, or AD. And it's been excavated at least 4 times that we know of. And there actually was a school teacher and his students who also probed around in it, because there was a 1-room schoolhouse also on the farm. But Frederick Ward Putnam from Harvard Peabody Museum came and explored it. Moorhead from the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Society explored it. Mills, also same place, explored it. And then in the 1970s, the last person to explore it was Naomi Grieber, one of the top female archaeologists that have ever been in the state of Ohio. And she left us with this image after she finished her work. Yes. So in the lighting here, I hope you can see this. So imagine this is 180 feet basically, from somewhere around here to somewhere around here. And every one of those white dots you see, that's a hickory post of some sort. So imagine the work that, first of all, that it took to construct 3 miles of earthworks to make that tripartite formation, and no less than this, and in some places much, much higher, and then this 180-foot long earthen covering for this, and then to cut all of those trees without modern chainsaws or whatever, to dig those post holes and to sink those to form at least, I copped out, I called it a multi-room wooden funerary structure. But
That's a good characteristic.
we got a circular structure here, probably the remnant of one here as well, a rectangular, probably the living room, a breezeway, and another one. And each of those would have been places where they processed the dead. And you've got to imagine within there, each of those rooms, there would have been screens, wooden structures with woven matting between them, so that they could say, well, we're processing the remains of so-and-so, and they would set that off. And that would remain open probably. This is a speculation, but it makes a lot of sense because they do find things that indicate this happened. Open for days, weeks, months, whatever it took, so that people could come from wherever and pay their respects to so-and-so who had passed away and leave deposits or whatever.
What evidence did they have to these structures?
Because there are artifacts that are deposited there, Yeah. So are those artifacts things that were automatically buried so this person could take it to the next life, or are these things that were brought by relatives and friends so that he would have them? Yeah, it's just hard to say, but
Well, they did find lots of barrels.
yeah, hundreds. Yeah, and stuff ended up in the Peabody Museum. Some of it's at the Ohio History Connection. Some of it's at the Field Museum in Chicago. And some of it, thanks to Nomi, is up at Case Western. So the artifacts are around and about. And unlike the harness collection, they're a little scattered, but at least they're recorded. And the harness collection, though, it's together. And that's what makes it so precious. So like I said, I'm going to take that earlier Squire and Davis image, and with the help of Rich Walker, we superimposed it on a topo map. Now keep your eye on this. There are things that you'll be able to recognize. So here's the peninsula. This is something that was actually eaten out by the creation of the Scioto River. It fluctuated back and forth between that 900-foot ridge and that 400-foot wall of sand and gravel, and it actually eroded into it and That's why you've got that big drop off.
So these structures were on top of the
So this is up on that terrace that was left behind by the last
makes sense.
glacier. So, ta-da! That's my artwork. It's as good as I could do. But so roughly, there's the tripartite earthwork, the Liberty earthworks, and within it, notice there's field Y, field V, field 18, 25, 14, the mound, and field 6. All of those are in relation to the sites that Bob hunted, and he actually found artifacts inside that. Naomi Grieber, this world-class archaeologist working just 2.5 miles up from the harness farm, she worked on an earthworks there, and she came to believe that once these were constructed, they were sacred areas, and you don't find any artifacts in there. But they did at Harness. All right. So first of all, we're going to talk about some of the Hopewell sites on the farm. And again, you've got to imagine this line here is the terrace. Everything else is bottoms or second terrace. There were 24 of the sites on the 24 of the 45 sites on the farm had Hopewellian artifacts associated with it, especially projectile points and knives. There were 13 in the upper terrace, 3 in the lower terrace, and 8 in the floodplain. So these Hopewell people are using everything, and they left behind evidence of it. Now, you can't say for sure whether, if there is no evidence of something down in the bottoms, that it wasn't being used because it floods. There's all kind of silt buildup and everything. But by Hopewell times, that stuff remained. And interestingly, first of all, I guess, so here are some examples of the kind of PPKs you find during the Hopewellian period. Beautiful range of flints, Flint Ridge, moss agate, all kind, probably Upper Mercer. Interesting to me, don't find much Delaware chert. And the Scioto River flows all the way from where the Delaware chert outcrops are. And it brings cobbles all the way down, and in the gravel bars in the Scioto, you would think they would have been exploring those and found it, but don't see much there. I find that strange, but I don't have the answer. The scale over here, give you an idea. It's in millimeters, but it's only that long. So most of those things are less than 3 inches, but they're right at 2.5 or so in our minds. I've been working with an archaeologist from Ohio University, and it's good to be able to say inches because all we've talked about is centimeters and millimeters for the past 6 days I've been with him here. So anyway, there also were the Bladeless I talked about, and 27 sites contain Bladeless. And there were 15 upper terrace sites, 3 lower, and 9 in the floodplain. So again, they're using all of this in relation to the earthworks here, and I've highlighted those all in red. And this is what the Bladeless look like. These are just thin flakes that have been struck off of a core. And if you look at them, if the lighting were a teeny bit darker, you would see that there are all these ridges running down through there because each of those Bladeless that are struck off peel themselves down and leave behind ridges where they were struck off, so that the next Bladelet that's struck off behind it will have those ridges on it. They are razor sharp. You'll find all kinds of evidence they've been modified, retouched, whatever, for use. I don't know that enough use-wear study has been done to tell us all the different uses, but in Europe these things are used for processing a lot of grassy materials. And in some cultures, this type of tool is snapped up and made into micro blades and attached to spear tips and things like that. But I don't know that we know for sure that that's happening here on the Harness Farm. And then this is where the Coors are. And again, 26 sites, and 15 upper, 3 lower, 8 in the floodplain. These people are active in the floodplain, which is really, really surprising, but not. Since, I mean, their focus is up there on the mounds. But look at the cores. So that's what the cores look like. And if you, this one kind of shows in the light, so you can see ridge, 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 ridge. So when they're striking this, and they actually strike this from down here where they've prepared a platform, and they peel it off, and there'll be a blade this wide, and so it'll have a ridge from the previous blade that had been struck in that area there. This may be valid area for future study. Site T, where Paul Pacheco and Deanne Weimer and a bunch of students from SUNY up in New York and Bloomingburg, is that it? In Pennsylvania, spent a couple summers working there on Site T, and they found 3 Hopewell period houses. And they don't know yet if they're quite contemporary or if it's the same group of people rebuilding after 5 or 6 years of dampness or whatever and living in the bottoms. But if that's a possible occupation site, I'm guessing these are all occupation sites, and I can see them living down there simply because you have access to the water, you have access to all these environments along the creeks and the sloughs and all of this and that. So it would have been a very attractive place. Interestingly, Ross County has no flint outcrops. So any person that's ever hunted in Ross County and found a, quote, arrowhead, that was brought in, that material was brought in. The nearest places are to acquire flint are over in Jackson County, which is kind of to the east, southeast of Ross County, and in Vinton County, which is almost due east. And everybody, when they think of Flint Ridge, they think of the best flint in Ohio, but actually Flint Ridge is just a locale where Ohio Vanport flint outcrops. So if you call everything that you see that is Vanport Flint Ridge, you're missing the boat, because there's an outcrop in Jackson County on Volga Road that's been well documented by a friend of mine. And there are also other sites where you can find Upper Mercer and this quote, southern Vanport in Vinton County. But beyond that, these people are getting their tool stone from as far away as Wyoming. They're using obsidian from Yellowstone. They're using Knife River flint from North Dakota. They're using Wyandotte flint from southern Indiana. And they're using Burlington chert from Illinois. That's why these people are so respected. When you study them, they had this vast network of whatever you want to call it, whether it's travel or trade. I don't think anybody can pin it down for sure, but they are getting resources to use from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away. They are building gigantic earthen architecture on the landscape. They have huge numbers. I don't think before the late woodland period there have been as many prehistoric burials that have been studied. I mean, this is a successful group of people, but we'll see, there's more to it. So if you do an analysis of the projectile point types in the collection, you find out that even though there are all these Hopewellian type tools, they were not the first people there. There were fluted point people there. A lot of people call these Clovis. They don't look exactly like the Clovis from the Clovis site, but they're definitely in that cluster, and that's what I'm talking about. Yes, yeah. The earliest found Clovises are a little bit flatter on the base or shallower on the concavity, but they all have, this next slide shows it. In red, is it showing up to anybody back there? But there's a huge flake that is driven off of the base of these, and they usually go about 2/3 of the way down the blade of the point, and that's why they're called fluted points, because they have a channel just like a flute. The musical instrument has a channel in it. And those flute flakes sometimes are on both sides, sometimes are on one side, and don't let anybody tell you they know for sure what they're used for, but there are a lot of archaeologists that have theories. Bloodletting, nah, definitely not that one. I think there are other ways to increase the bloodletting without all that work. The risk is they break 1 out of every 5 of these when they fluted it. So just for that, when you can get bloodletting other ways, I don't think you risk breaking them just to do that. Some people think it's to thin it down for mounting on a handle or in a shaft. More study, that's all I'm going to say.
So which time period is this?
So this is the earliest documented people in Ohio. These are These are the people that would have seen the glacier.
Pre-archaic.
They're pre-archaic, yes. These are the people that would have seen traces of the glacier itself, the mammoths, mastodon, all of the imagine. So when I found this point, and I definitely found this one and this one and this one, about had a heart attack. I go, I am the first person to touch this since a mammoth hunter, mastodon hunter, a glacier person handled it, you know? And that's just an incredible feeling. Bob found an entire one there, left of center. There was one more that came off of the farm that got away. It was a friend of Bob's who was associated with selling seeds for farming. And he let him hunt with him, and this guy found an intact fluted point, and Bob let him keep it because they'd already been finding things like that. And he thought this guy's going to live out his life in Benton County and no problem. The guy moved to Florida, and nobody knows what happened to the points. And it's the biggest escape from the collection because these things are rare. I mean, even though they're, believe it or not, these things date back 12, 13,000 years ago, and there have been tens of thousands of them found because I think the use life of these is very short. I think these guys made them to use for something, and they used them up, and as long as they had a new supply of flint, they would start out and craft another one. But it's not like they're fighting battles and leaving these. When I grew up, that's what the stories. Oh, you'll find arrowheads all over the place in this field. There must have been a great Indian battle here. No, these are sites where people are. They have workshops. They're processing stuff, and all of this and that. Yeah, now we're getting food. So where were the fluted points found? There were 4 sites on the farm, 3 on the upper terrace, and 1 on the edge of a second terrace here. The big one is Site 28, and someday I'm hoping we're going to get the current landowners to agree to let us probe that out and find out what all went on there. And I'd like to even build off of that and contact the farmers for 5.5 miles up there and see what evidence we can find of a paleo presence in southern Ohio. All the way to High Bank. Yeah. And, you know, if you know anything about Ohio archaeology, you can't name more than a handful of paleo sites. There's Paleo Crossing, possibly the burning tree mastodon. At least there's scratch marks on the bone that indicate something like that. There aren't a lot of them. Down in Sandy Springs, a lot of points have been found there near the Ohio River. But gee, it's special. And we know so little about these people, let alone even the Hopewell that left so much behind. And I talked with Joe Gingrich, who went to the University of Wyoming, studied with George Frizen. I mean, that's like studying with God of paleoarchaeology. It's that important. And he says, you're not going to find much left behind by these people because they didn't stay in any place long enough to die there and bury them there. They're moving, and we don't find burials. There's a burial up in Montana. They're finding a couple up in the Yukon, but there aren't many actual burials that have ever been studied from the Paleo period. Well, that's all possible. And then, but there's a site down in Florida called the Wendover site, and it dates back to about 7,000 BC. And this site has dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of burials, and these people are all in a fetal position, wrapped in some kind of a cloth wrapping, and they're staked into the bottom of this water bog. So maybe these, even from early times, people were burying in water. It's an interesting theory because there's Wendover, Windover. Yeah, you know, so how far back does that tradition go? You know, we don't know. There's so much we don't know, but there's so, and you know, places like this can help peel back the various layers of that onion. So it may be a possible habitation site or at least a work site. And if it was a habitation site, what could we expect? I mean, we have all kinds of documentation of the Hopewellian site, habitation sites down in the bottoms, but these people are on the go. They're not putting a lot of posts in the ground. they probably are doing something with a teepee-like structure, and they probably take the poles of that teepee and they use those to make travois, which they either fasten to their dogs or whatever, because these people had dogs, and they can haul all their supplies with them until they go to their next spot. And that way you can keep reusing those teepee posts. There's an archaeologist that went to school with Joe Gingrich and studied with George Frizen. I really revere this old guy. I've seen a lot of things that he's talked about. And this guy named Todd Suravel has actually lived in, I guess it would be almost Mongolia, with the people there who do have motorized sleds, and they have reindeer, and they live in teepees year round. And he studies what that lifestyle is like, just to see how that might apply to a paleo type way of living. Again, we're peeling back the onion, but we don't have all the details. So anyway, if they did have a teepee-like structure, these people knew how to weave. They would have interwoven reed mats, and there are sites out west going back like Paisley Caves. They've actually found a layer with woven mat flooring in there. So undoubtedly these people would have done something like that to make it habitable. They would have covered their teepee with around the base with animal hides, and there should have been all kinds of posts around there for lean-to shelters and drying racks for drying fish and meat and whatever. And these are the ultimate mobile big game hunters and explorers, and to me these are the greatest explorers maybe that have ever lived, to have come into North America whenever they did, because there's a lot of new information coming out there, but they basically covered every nook and cranny in the United States within 500 years on foot. They did not have the horse. I mean, that's just incredible when you think about it. So it's a Site 28. It's a terrace edge site. Has a peninsula down below it there, just a few feet. It overlooks that sandstone ridge, the floodplain, the river valley, and they can monitor any human or animal activity up and down the Scioto. Plus, if they follow the Scioto 30 miles, they'll be in Jackson, Ohio, where there's a huge salt dome. If they go 8 more miles over to Wellston, they can find flint. If they go 15 miles back to the west, they'll find more flint, and they're 15 miles away from Harness again. So it's all within walking distance. To me, it's an ideal place to stay more than one night, and that's why I think an exploration of what's underground there may turn up proof that they were staying there. That's just my guess, though. Not only is there early paleo stuff, there's also evidence of late paleo stuff. These are agate basin points, and the range of these people is incredible. Let me show you this. These were big herd bison hunters, and they were as mobile as the Clovis people, and the only difference, they're using a lanceolate shaped PPK, but it doesn't have flutes, and it tends to be thicker, and I call them lenticular, which means it's like the lens of your eye. It's kind of oval shaped when you do a cross section of it. And all of the Harness agate basin points are made of Upper Mercer flint, which came from 125 miles away. Interestingly, the evidence for the presence of the archaic PPKs in the collection only represent 20% of the collection, but 60 different point styles. So even though we're only, it's 80% is Hopewell, and it's 3 or 4 different point styles. But if you look at that remaining 20%, that's 60 different point styles. And we are talking about 8,000 years of habitation and activity on this farm. And why so many new point styles? There's a warming trend in the Holocene, climate kicking in, and all kinds of plant and animal resources are changing. And when we look at these points, you're going to see some have square or angled stems, some have bifurcated stems, some have corner notching, I don't really believe in the side notching. I really think side notching is a corner notch point that had tangs that stuck down as shoulders, and that those broke off or were sharpened away, leaving the appearance of a side notch. There may be a few, but really a lot of them show that evidence to me, and I've handled 40,000 of them easily. So.
They noticed some
Well, I, I think you got to look at it as technology rather than clan. So maybe there's a little difference in what they're processing or what their food sources are, but every one of these tools is designed to be hafted, and you want the most secure haft possible to any blade or spear point that you're using. My father was a mechanic for his entire life, and if he had a tool of any sort that wobbled in the handle, pew, into the trash can. And it messed up anything he was trying to do because he couldn't count on being steady-handed with it. So here are some of the points that start kicking in about 8,000 years before those Hopewell people. And that's just a small smattering of the point styles. One of the most rare points ever found in Ohio, 3 of these are found on the harness farm. It's called a Decatur. And it's very frustrating to me, and probably to archaeologists too, because people really take the artifact and run with it, and their imagination goes wild. And if you look, like, there's a site called projectilepoints.net. If you go to that site, it gives great information, and then it's got all these crappy pictures at the bottom because people submit their pictures of what they think was a Clovis or what it was an agate basin, and you'll see Hopewell points identified as corner notches. And I'm going, people just don't really take the time to look at them closely enough and distinguish all the different corner notches and all the different possible side notches and stems, because there aren't many more ways that you can create a base to notch those things into a handle. And so those get repeated, rediscovered, and repeated. So there are corner notch points from the end of the agate period all the way down through the Hopewell period. Even the intrusive mound. There's a corner notch point used by the intrusive mound people. So anyway, sizes here. This one is almost 5 inches long, and it was found in 2 pieces just to show you how good Bob's record keeping was. Russ Brown pasture, site Z. Russ Brown pasture, site Z. And here's the break right there. He even recorded the different dates that he found those on. I don't know. I can go on. I can wrap soon if you need me to. Okay. What time is it? I have no idea. Okay. Give me 5 minutes? All right. So anyway, this is the beginning, and what I'm going to do, and this is a work in progress. I haven't even gone through the entire type collection yet. I've only done about 1/3 of it. And I'm going to go through and analyze the landforms that each of the various identifiable point types are associated with. And then I'm going to come back and do an overview of who is living and what tools they're using on that landscape. So this is a process that's probably going to take me 2 more years to finish. So moving along here. With the disappearance of the Pleistocene megafauna, you've got, I think this is important, plant and animal resource management. These people knew their environment. Don't think of them as just out there feeling their way through nature. They knew what every plant, every leaf, every piece of bark, every root of a plant, every rock could be used for. They were constantly experimenting with those. And when I did surface collection, I would find all kinds of rocks you wouldn't expect to find on a site. And lead. What would they bring lead there for? Well, there are artifacts made out of lead, and they knew how to do that. So that's an important thing. And they are using fire at various stages during the Archaic period to encourage the growth of certain plants and discourage the growth of undesirables, and to create environments for deer and things like that. I don't know that they've pinned it down yet, and it varies around the world. And they're finding so much more in Europe and Asia right now. Göbekli Tepe, and my God. So I don't know where this is going to fit in, but I'm guessing it's early on, but I'm guessing. I mean, I'm not going to drive you in the wrong direction. They're pre-agricultural, at least here, although there's agriculture in the Ukraine by the Paleo period. They're pre-pottery. They probably wove their own baskets and made cloth bags. They had earth ovens and fire pits. And this, to me, comes from my collecting. It's just my opinion. Their foraging strategies are driven by the seasons. They knew when the antler were going to be shed by the deer in February. They knew when the geese are going to be flying by both ways. And I think they're developing calendars because they had to know that.
Again,
Yeah, and it's way before the Hopewell people and their possible earthwork alignments. We're going to only do one more, although I've got plenty here. But today, these are all, quote, dovetails or St. Charles points, and they're in various conditions of, or various stages of condition. Even with only this much, we know that this is a dovetail. As long as you've got the, yeah, as long as you've got the bottom part of a remnant of a point, you can figure out what it is. If I've got this, I can't tell what it is at all. And so it's just as valuable to find the base as it is to find an entire piece. And all of those are varieties of dovetails. And where were the dovetails found? Interestingly, there were 7 of them found, 5 on the upper terraces, 2 in the lower, and possibly because of flooding, whatever, but none in the floodplain sites. And I'm going to zoom ahead, and I'm going to end it, unfortunately for me. But they are associated with the people who use the Thebes points, and there's the territory where you will find dovetail points in the United States. Nothing west of the Mississippi to speak of. And that's an interesting phenomenon. Whoops. And they believe that those point styles or types are related to the people who made the Thebes bases. Yeah. These are as highly crafted as the dovetails and as desirable to collectors. Now I'm zooming. The Decators, zooming, I'm zooming. And I want to take you to the bifurcates. I mean, I've mapped all of this out, but I want to lead you right up to something here. Whoops, that's the next one. Last thing to emphasize, the people who make Amos points, and these date back to about 6000 BC, and for some reason there is a cluster of them in an area about the size of this tent. And Sean didn't identify those. He didn't know those, so that's one I've added, but I've consulted 3 archaeologists and several other collectors, and they've agreed with me those have to be Amos. And if you look at this next slide, look at the small territory they're used at. And interestingly, the center of it's right here in Kanawha County, West Virginia, and the harness farm is on the northwesternmost fringe. What brought them there about that terrain? And that's the problem I want to solve. And then lastly, these are not Amos points, but they look in many ways like Amos points. How many other point types are just in that one slide there? And that's the problem I'm going to be wrestling with for the next 2 years. Thank you for your attention. Stand by for more.